are back in the barnyard area. We've already talked a little bit on another segment about our memories of living on a farm or visiting a farm. Even if you didn't live on a farm, maybe you had an aunt and uncle or a grandparent that did, and going to visit them and all the things that you saw, the things you ate, even the smells that you smelled, right? And think about the barnyard. There are probably plenty of barnyard smells to remember as well. And I just think that having the barnyard and all of the animals brings back a lot of memories for me. When I first moved to Minnesota, I myself had not lived on a farm, and we had an aunt and uncle. My husband's aunt and uncle invited us to come and help with butchering chickens. And what an education that was for me. And I think back to how that must have been for some of you growing up on a farm, and but even farther back for those early homesteaders, and how the just raising animals on a diversified farm, or even some of the larger farms. I mean, now in Ottertail County we have some massive turkey farms, and people raising, we have dairy farms that are fantastic operations, and also, well, just a variety. But I have some, thinking back to our homesteaders, I've mentioned before the Cutlerites, and we know that the animals they brought with them were oxen and horses. Those were animals that were going to be used in the farming operation. But they also brought with them cows. And one of my favorite stories from the old Clitheroe storybook is how they would milk the cows in the morning, and they would put the milk into a can that was tied with a wire, and they would attach that to their covered wagon. And as the wagon moved and jostled during the day while they traveled maybe 10 miles to the next, probably not even that much, to the next location, by the time they got to set up their camp for the night and circled the wagons, they could open up that can of milk, and it would have churned itself, and they had butter that they could use for their dinner. I mean, talk about ingenuity and fantastic people. Now, this is again a story from the old Clitheroe storybook, but one person who wrote in that book said she remembered her mother baking bread for them along the route as they traveled and using that delicious butter. But she said one time they put the Dutch oven under the covered wagon too, and in the morning when they opened up the lid for the Dutch oven, there was a snake curled up inside. Wouldn't that be a wonderful surprise for any person, not just a mom? Well, so we know that they had also sheep. I've talked about that before. They had a woman who was in charge of the flock for the Cutlerites, and she walked and guided the sheep. And so that when they got to Ottertail County, they were self-sufficient enough to be able to make their own cloth, to knit their own socks and mittens and hats and so on. So these are the first animals, domesticated animals, that came to Ottertail County. We had horses, oxen, cows, and sheep. And over time, as more and more people came in, chickens were added to that. Prairie chickens, of course, were very numerous here in Ottertail County. People could eat those for themselves. And it was only later in the early 1900s that we started raising turkeys in Ottertail County. So it was important, in addition to having the sheep, cows, and so on, farm families really relied on pork. And so we have pork producers here today, but pork back in those days was not just a product, a food product. It was something that provided lots of other useful items that a farm family would need. So we have in the museum a display of a sow, a Hampshire pig, and this is a special breed from the UK, United Kingdom, and also her little piglets. And they look like, I think, little Oreo cookies. So think about what kind of pig you had on your farm, what breed that was. But this is a type of pig that is specifically very fatty. It has an added amount of fat to it. And this was important for farm families because they often made candles out of that lard that was left over. They would render that and then make their own candles. This candle I have is made out of beeswax, but this is a candle mold that we have at the museum. And that process of making candles involves melting that lard, and then you would take string, the wicking. The wicking is pulled through on the bottom, and you're going to be, in the end, you're going to have a dozen candles, but maybe put a stick underneath the wicking here and let that pour in the melted tallow, right? And then when that's set solid, you heat it a little bit, maybe dip this in warm water, and then pull that stick up, and you're going to come up with 6 sets of 2 candles that are attached. The other product that was extremely necessary on a farm, we've talked about wash day in another segment, is being able to make soap. And so by having a pig that, in addition to having meat and being very fertile, also has a lot of fat, you're going to have that fat for making your own homemade soap. Sometimes people made a hand soap from chicken fat, but that doesn't really set up like a bar of soap like you would get from a steer or a pig. I have some other products here that are related to dairy farming, and at one time Ottertail County had more dairy farms than any other county in the state. I say that a lot, don't I? More than any other county in Minnesota, but we were a center for dairy farming. And so I have, throughout the museum, we have different versions of a churn. I just talked a little bit about churning by having the can that rocks under the covered wagon, but here's a hand churn. And then things like this is a cream skimmer for skimming that cream off the top. I did have a fellow one time say that he thought he could use that for skimming minnows out of his minnow bucket, but I'm not sure if that's a good idea. And then a butter mold. And a lot of our farm women were able to take the eggs that they raised and the butter that they had churned into town when they would go in, and they could trade that at the general store for things that they needed. And so a butter mold like this one, which has, now I've seen this, I've always thought this was a pineapple, but now I'm thinking it's a thistle. And make pineapple or thistle, whatever, the butter is pushed in there, and when it pops out, it has this beautiful design on the top, and this was more likely to sell. It's just a little fancier, just like the difference between buying Land O'Lakes and then the store-bought brand, right? Their store brand of butter. And this was great for women. They had pocket money. They had money that they could use at Christmas time during the holidays to buy things that they wanted. Just a little extra. Some of the other things I have here, if you're raising dairy cattle, some of them have they could be dangerous, right? I mean, generally you want to have a nice, gentle cow, but not all of them are that way. And so we've got a cattle horn weight here that you can see through it. And this goes on the end of the cow's horn, the cow with the crumpled horn, right? And that's what that means. They crumpled it. It was going to, as this would weigh down and pull that horn down, so it was a less dangerous horn. Now, some people will remember that there used to be a person that might visit from farm to farm and would cut those horns off if that was a problem. But I mentioned the pig, and I should have shown this tool. This is another homemade tool for butchering pigs, and we have a display here at the museum of a pig that's going to be soaked or dunked into boiling hot water to loosen it up a little bit. And a tool like this has a wooden handle and is metal, is for scraping the hog hairs, the bristles off of the hog. And so that was, which That's important too. And then the last thing I have to show, we have in our blacksmith shop, you can see the horseshoes. This was important for protecting the horse's hoof and giving it traction and so on. Well, oxen need that too, especially if it's muddy or icy or what have you. And ox shoes are separated. So you paid a little bit more, right, if you were getting your ox shoe because they have a cloven hoof. And so an ox shoe comes in 2 different bits like this. All right. Well, thinking about our animals that we know on the farm, perhaps you had a pet, or maybe you were in 4-H and you showed that sheep or you showed that calf at the state fair or county fair, and what great memories we have of the animals on our farm, whether it's the great food that our mothers and grandmothers made from that animal, or whether it was our pet, or because I didn't mention dogs and cats that are on our farms, but I hope you enjoyed this trip back down memory lane, thinking about our animals on the farm.